If you care about real history rather than fantasy versions of it, subscribe to the Global War Archive now, because this channel exists for people who want uncomfortable truths, not fairy tales. Tonight, we are talking about medieval food and why it was so consistently bad that survival itself often depended more on luck than skill. This is not a cozy story about rustic bread and hearthfires. This is about why eating in medieval Europe was monotonous, nutritionally fragile, dangerous, and psychologically draining for most of the population, and why understanding that reality matters for historians and survival-minded people today. For the vast majority of medieval people, food was repetitive to the point of mental fatigue. Peasants lived on grain-based diets because grain stored well, could be taxed easily, and fed large populations with minimal land. Rye, barley, oats, and sometimes wheat were turned into coarse bread or thin pottage eaten morning and night. Variety was rare, not because people lacked imagination, but because ecosystems, transport, and preservation limited what could realistically be eaten. Without refrigeration or modern canning, freshness was a luxury. If you want to apply this today, the lesson is simple. Calorie security beats culinary creativity in survival conditions. Medieval diets show what happens when storage stability becomes the primary goal of food planning. Most medieval food was preserved through salting, drying, smoking, or fermenting, and each method damaged nutritional quality over time. Salted meat could last for months, but it often became so hard and overcured that it required boiling for hours just to be edible. Smoked fish absorbed bitter compounds that masked spoilage, but did nothing to prevent long-term nutrient loss. Fermentation kept vegetables alive longer, but, poorly controlled processes led to mold contamination and illness. Medieval cooks understood preservation pragmatically, not scientifically. For modern survivalists, the takeaway is to master preservation with precision. The medieval failure was not preservation itself, but lack of temperature control, hygiene, and nutritional balance. Even in years without famine, medieval people lived in a constant state of near hunger. Bread filled the stomach, but did not meet micronutrient needs. Protein intake was low for peasants, especially in winter when livestock could not be spared for slaughter. Seasonal hunger, known as the lean months, hit hardest before harvest when stored grain ran thin. This chronic undernourishment weakened immune systems, making populations vulnerable to disease outbreaks like the Black Death. The modern lesson here is that long-term calorie sufficiency without nutritional diversity leads to collapse. Stockpiling food is meaningless if it does not sustain the body beyond mere survival. The medieval church controlled eating habits as much as belief systems. Under the authority of the Catholic Church, fasting days eliminated meat, dairy, and eggs for nearly half the year. Fish replaced meat, but inland communities had limited access to fresh fish, leading to over-reliance on salted or dried alternatives. Religious discipline took priority over physical health. While elites could bend these rules through dispensations or imported food, peasants could not. This teaches a brutal survival truth. External authority over food access can be as dangerous as environmental scarcity. Control of diet is control of population resilience. Medieval kitchens lacked precision. Open hearths offered uneven heat. Iron cookware reacted with acidic foods, and grinding grain by hand produced inconsistent flour filled with grit that wore down teeth over time. Cooking back then was less about transformation and, honestly, more about damage control. Burnt bread was, pretty common. Undercooked stews, unfortunately, spread parasites. Food safety standards simply did not exist. From a modern preparedness angle, this really highlights the importance of having reliable cooking tools. Fire alone just isn't enough. Control, consistency, and sanitation matter just as much as the ingredients themselves. Nobles ate differently, but not necessarily better. While elites had access to meat, spices, and imported wine, their diets were frankly heavy, unbalanced, and often excessive. Gout, digestive disorders, and obesity plagued the upper classes. Peasants suffered scarcity, while nobles suffered excess. Both diets were honestly unhealthy, though in opposite ways. The medieval system really proved that inequality in food access damages everyone, not just the poor. A balanced diet is not a luxury, it's actually a structural requirement for a stable society. Trade did exist, but, it mostly served cities and elites, not rural populations. Spices from Asia, olive oil from the Mediterranean, and wine from southern Europe, well, they rarely reached common tables. Roads were slow, dangerous, and frankly, quite seasonal. After the fall of the Roman Empire, political fragmentation meant that, local isolation really defined how people accessed food. The practical lesson here is that resilience, truly depends on local food systems. Back in the medieval period, dependence on these fragile trade networks made diets incredibly vulnerable to war, unpredictable weather, and, of course, taxation. Medieval food was, honestly, pretty bad. Not because people were ignorant, but because the systems themselves failed them. Climate instability, rigid authority, limited technology, and a poor understanding of nutrition all combined to create diets that were, unfortunately, optimized for short-term survival rather than long-term health. Studying this period really shows us what can happen when food systems put control, storage, and tradition ahead of adaptability. So the takeaway here is to build food plans that emphasize diversity, nutrient density, and preservation methods you can actually manage, especially under stress. If this deep dive has added something real to your understanding of history and survival, go ahead and subscribe to the Global War Archive, share this with someone who still romanticizes medieval life, and, keep supporting serious historical content that respects the past enough to tell the truth about it.